I want to get a quick show of hands. How many of you, after this last 2-3 days, I'll fall over here, after this last 2-3 days are more optimistic about the world than you were when you got in here? Okay. And how many of you are more pessimistic? Okay. And how many of you don't have any opinion about whether you're more optimistic or pessimistic? Okay, the rest of you. All right, so there's about 50, 60%, very few more pessimistic, which is fabulous because we have kind of this incredible, Ray has mentioned quite a few times that the real challenge is how do you extract the promise of peril without the promise of technology without the peril. And now that we believe technology is a major driver of progress in the world, maybe the only major driver of progress, and now that we have a dozen technologies moving at this rapid pace, we get bubbly excited about what's possible. But there are some very fundamental kind of key questions that are hitting every industry in the world today. And this is going to affect us for the next couple of decades on how we transition all of our legacy thoughts and our societies into this play. So I'm going to summarize a little bit about what we've talked about today and then wrap up answering a couple of the questions that we had. This kind of fundamental chart should be burned into your foreheads by now in terms of this fundamental linear versus exponential distinction. Very, very hard to get our heads around, right? And this, if you don't spot these doubling patterns early, they disrupt you really badly. If you disrupt them early, it's the biggest advantage you could possibly have. And so I think one thing to think about is how do you spot these disruptive patterns early? In a kind of a tongue-in-cheek, here's the phrase exponential growth, which has been growing exponentially over the last couple of decades. So there's a slightly more lighthearted look as to what's happening, and we like to see this kind of thing. And of course, we've got these patterns going along. These, Peter talks about his 6Ds framework, where we digitize, we get disruptive, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these technologies are now in that doubling pattern. The resolution at which we can image the brain is doubling every year, right? Drones are doubling every 9 months in their price performance. Biotech, we're doubling that every 6 months or so. And now this incredible pattern as all these technologies. Now, each one is doubling on its own. But where they intersect, that adds a whole other multiplier to the equation. And the aggregate effect is absolutely profound. One way I like to frame it is this particular graph. This is the cost of light over a 700-year period. And so if you can see the numbers, this is from 1300 to today. And really interesting and important is the shape of this curve. Very, very expensive, plateaus for a while, and then literally crashes to zero as we apply human engineering and scale to this problem. So that shape of that curve is very interesting. That's the cost of light. Well, there's the cost of DNA sequencing that you've seen from some of Raymond's work and some of our thinking. Very similar shape, right? And if you saw Ramez's charts, here's the cost of solar modules, and see again the same shape. And across all of these technologies, the cost is crashing to zero. And this speaks to that whole demonetization thing. And this gives us very exciting. In solar, a quarter of all of the farms in California are now solar powered. And maybe in the ultimate irony, the Kentucky Coal Museum is now using solar panels to power itself, which I find absolutely, how do they look themselves in the mirror is my question when they've got solar panels powering the damn museum. That's I want to visit just to see it, right? Just I actually tried to live this myself. A few months ago, I actually took a Tesla and I drove from Miami to Toronto. I went kind of 1,600 miles. And I would get on the highway, I'd hit the autonomous car mode. The car drove itself. I essentially had a private train crossing the whole country. And because the charging stations are free, the entire trip cost me zero. Right? This was a Gutenberg moment for me. You all remember the printing press in the 15th century where the printing press changed everything. Well, today I would say that we have about 20 such Gutenberg moments hitting us at the same time. You know, just autonomous cars changes everything. Then you add in drones, then you add in Bitcoin and solar and biotech and AI. And this is profound. This is profound in terms of how much is hitting us in that sense. Now, that's very disruptive because of the technologies are all very sexy. But as a society, we are not set up to absorb this pace of change. In fact, I will argue that every mechanism that we use to run the world, our civics, our politics, our legal systems, our healthcare systems, intellectual property, education, all designed for a world a few hundred years ago, right? Not for today. Definitely not for 1 trillion sensors coming down the pike. We actually need to re-architect pretty much every mechanism by which we run society. I'll give you 2 examples that I think make it very real. For a few years now, I've been saying that democracy does not work in a world of 1 trillion sensors. We invented representative democracies when information was scarce. If you were in DC, you had no idea what was happening in California. The speed of a horse was as fast as you could find out. So you had a representative come and say, here's what my people are thinking. And we met a couple of times a year in session so that people could have time to get to DC collectively and say what's happening. Well, today we have an abundance of information which can be misused, misinterpreted, faked, and every major democracy in the world today is broken. India, broken. Brazil is broken. The UK broke last year, trying to fix itself as of today, but the US is breaking in front of our eyes. Right? In fact, every major country has a problem because it used to be a huge advantage to be a big country before. You had multiple industries and critical mass, abundance of natural resources, but now we need agility and adaptability, and these big countries are brittle and very fragile. And so we have enormous challenges around ourselves. So democracy doesn't work going forward. And how do we update that? And think of all of our leadership, especially on the political side. They're all set up to manage a predictable, stable, linear, scarcity-based world. And we are entering this kind of 20 Gutenberg moments chaos that's about to hit us, Black Swan Central. Right? And so that's an enormous. Let me take a slightly more lighthearted view. Take the institution of marriage. You know, we invented marriage about 15,000 years ago, and when marriage first arrived on the scene, average lifespan was about 25. So you got married, you had kids, you died. It was not designed to last 50, 60 years, right? And as we get to doubling human lifespan in the next, say, decade or two, are we supposed to live with the same person for 100 years? That's crazy. I call that state-sanctioned torture is basically what that is. Right? I mean, my wife gave me permission to say that, by the way. So how do we update these institutions? And this is the central challenge facing us globally today, because our existing systems have this problem. Now, what happens is when you hear about new technology, your amygdala freaks out, and hopefully Peter talked a little bit about that. Did he mention this? Right? So we all have this little amygdala on the back of our brains that's constantly scanning for bad news. It's an evolutionary mechanism. When we were evolving on the plains of Africa, if you heard a noise in the bushes, you ran, because bad news could kill you. If I missed a piece of good news, I might miss some fruit that I could eat. If I missed a piece of bad news, I died. So we're actually 10 times more likely to listen to bad news than we are to listen to good news, and Peter talks about this in this book, Abundance. This is why Fox News is very successful. So if you watch Fox News, you're pretty much going to die this week, right? If you're really lucky, it'll last till next week, but then you're going to die next week. Right? And so this is the big challenge. And often what happens is when you hear something new, your amygdala freaks out because our brain immediately associates it with danger, and it evokes a fight or flight response. So when people first hear about the Google car, the initial reaction is, oh my God, that car might kill somebody, ban the car. Because people don't like to be killed by robots, as my colleague Brad Templeton will say. Now, we'd much rather be killed by drunk people, which is what's happening today. Right? And so we need to get through that initial wave and deal with this amygdala response or immune system response as we talked about it. Douglas Adams, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, put it typically best. He said, anything in the world when you're born is normal. Anything when you're born when you're a young adult, you can make a career out of it. Anything born after you're 35 years old is just wrong. Right? I think that pretty much summarizes what's happening in the world today. Now, yet, even though our amygdala is freaking out and we're operating in the politics of fear, we of course can see that we're living in the most magically positive, abundant time ever. This is simply put the best time to be alive in the history of mankind. The only time that's going to be better is next week, next month, next year, next decade, because things are going to get very much better. Bill Gates thinks we'll have eradicated extreme poverty by 2030. Now, unfortunately, you won't see this in the news because it's good news and it doesn't sell. This is just the last 100 years from some of Peter's work in abundance. Now, are two areas that we've talked about quite a bit during this conference. One is jobs. And we're not really worried about radical job loss, as you might surmise, but we're really worried about the transformation in jobs. Here are 50 jobs in 25 industries that get disrupted just by autonomous cars. Right? And so this is a huge challenge. But maybe the biggest disruption that's coming is climate change. We're deeply worried about that. I've been living in Miami these last 3 years because, according to our numbers, in about 25 years, Miami's gone. The sea level is rising about 1/2 inch a year there. And so better live there now and enjoy it before it disappears, is my theory. And so how do we deal with that? In fact, one of the biggest challenges in the world today, which is ISIS, is actually an outcome of climate change. There was a 7-year drought in that region. The farmers couldn't grow any crops. Everybody moved into the cities, created a hotbed of problems, and then that exploded into ISIS. And so this is a challenge. In fact, what we see today everywhere is we're seeing the rise of the Luddite movement, the reactionary forces. Pockets of people in every ideology are saying, I can't take this pace of change, right? Hindu nationalists, Jewish settlers, Muslim radicals, Christian evangelicals. Why? Because people would much rather be comfortable than happy. And so we try and strive for a time when we understood the world better, because we can't take this pace of change. I actually believe this is a fundamental failure of leadership. Our leadership today cannot articulate this magical future, and then we end up in the politics of fear. And then we vote based on that result, and then you end up in a hell of a mess like we have globally today. So this is the big challenge. How do we overcome all of these areas? Now, from an economic perspective, we've seen, this is the curve I like to look at. This is what happened to the newspaper industry when you fully digitized it. And we find that when you fully digitize an industry and go end-to-end digital, you tend to see this deflationary cliff take place. The same thing happened in the music industry. This will happen in the car industry in about 5 to 6 years, in my opinion. I think we'll go through 2 waves in the car industry. One is electrical and battery-based cars phasing out combustion engines. And then in about 8 to 10 years, it will make no sense to buy a car at all, because we'll have some sort of automated Uber-type service. Everything is moving from a product to a service in more and more industries, right? Now, we've talked about how hard this is to spot and the linear to exponential thing. When the Google car first came out, the cost of the LiDAR, the GPS, the radar, the sensors added up to about $200,000 a car. And all the car companies looked at that and said, cute research project, but you'll never commercialize that. 2 years later, it was $100,000 a car. 2 years later, $50,000 a car. Even then, the answer was, well, who's going to pay $50,000 for all of those sensors, right? You may be aware that we're down below $1,000 a car now for all the sensors. And now everybody's jumping on the bandwagon a little bit too late. The cost of that LiDAR at the top of that Prius cost $75,000 5 years ago. You can buy that today for $50. Why? Because you have multiple technologies doubling on their own, and the aggregate effect results in orders of magnitude per hop. Right? And of course, the next version is going to cost $10, and it will look like that because it'll disappear and dematerialize into your cell phone. And this is happening across the board, across all of these areas. I love this kind of particular one. In 2010, Ericsson made this prediction that we would have 50 billion devices out on the internet by the end of the decade. And at the time, the entire tech world says this makes no sense. We only have 5-6 billion people. Why would we need 50 billion devices? I talked to Ericsson a few months ago, and they said, we were wrong about our 50 billion. Our new prediction is 500 billion by the end of the decade. And something that we see very, very consistently is where you have a domain that's growing exponentially, the experts in that domain will be wrong by about 10x. This is not a math error. This is a cognitive error. And let me give you one more example to bring the point home. You all saw this graph from Ramez. In 2003, the leading solar energy expert in the world said this. He said, look, if you add up the physical cost of the silver, the glass, the wiring, we will never drop below $1 a watt. That's the blow. That's the base. That's as low as it can possibly go. You can see the market actually believed him for a little bit. Then it started to drop, kept dropping. We're down to about 18 cents a watt today, and his latest comment is there at the bottom. It says, getting below $1, okay, it's exceeded my expectations, right? And as Peter mentioned, we're fond of saying an expert will tell you how you cannot do something because the models they're operating off are out of date. And the reason this is inexorable and unstoppable is the sheer democratization of all of this. All of these technologies going through this curve where the domain becomes digital, you get open source communities forming, and then you get radical disruption of the status quo. Whether it's drones or Bitcoin or biotech or all of these are going through this type of a pattern. Now, this means any entrepreneur can enter a legacy industry with a beginner's mind, leverage new technologies, and completely disrupt it. Right? Elon Musk may be the best example. No experience in the car sector, energy sector, space industry, and yet he's created market leaders in all of them. And his MO is very simple. He looks at an accelerating technology, aims 10 years out and looks over where the doubling pattern will be, and then launches a company to intercept that curve. And that's a pretty good way of working around it. And as you may be familiar with the Hyperloop that he's trying to, that's designed, is now being built by several companies to do transportation very, very fast. Actually, he wanted to go from LA to San Francisco in 20 minutes at about 4,000 miles an hour. And as an example of the mindset, I was chatting with him about this, and I said, Elon, I have a degree in theoretical physics. If you accelerate somebody from 0 to 4,000 miles an hour and then decelerate them back to 0, you're probably going to kill them. And his answer was, yeah, it's an issue, right? Because I'm thinking, I'm the expert going, intractable problem. He's like, yeah, we have to overcome that problem. That's the mindset. That's the mindset that we're seeing now across the board. And when that mindset intercepts and leverages accelerating technologies, look out world in a positive way. And so that's where we get very excited. And this distributes very fabulously. Here, this is a fishing village in Vietnam where a ship used to come to deliver diesel fuel for their fishing boats. One day the ship stopped coming. They had no fuel to power their boats. They invented a solar-powered boat. So here you have disruptive innovation using accelerating technologies happening at the edge of civilization. And we get incredibly happy and excited when we see this, because once these guys get their hands on drones and 3D printers and Lord knows CRISPR, things will get very interesting indeed, right? And there's some incredible things happening across in the medical field. This company has figured out how to solve superbugs. They can cure antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And by the way, as a side effect, they can cure all allergies. Kind of a cool company. And so this dozens and hundreds of these startups attacking all of these spaces mean we will nail a lot of these problems very, very quickly in this way, all driven by this pace and change in computing living in this world. Now, I talked about this kind of sprint idea to solve the immune system problem in companies. We've actually been applying this to cities, and I think this is the question that was asked. How do you apply this to the public sector? So we've actually created a nonprofit called the Fast Track Institute, where we go into a city and we find we can solve a problem facing a city for about 1/10 the current cost. We've run this 3 cycles with, in Medellin in Colombia with the mayor there, and we're about to sign a major American city to figure out what's the future of transportation at 1/10 of the existing cost of transportation. And the way it works is you take a problem like transportation and you go through 4 layers of it. The first layer is looking at what technologies might radically affect that space. If you ask the Department of Transport in any city, what's your future? They'll say we need to build more steel on steel rails. That's basically the answer, because they don't know of what's coming. But when you can show them hyperloops and autonomous cars and the radical cost drop, things get exciting. The second layer is to go through a design layer and say, okay, what would this look like portrayed in society? Let's do some of that. What's the media narrative around it, et cetera. The third layer looks at the money side and said, okay, how do you fund this? Do you raise taxes? Do you do pay-per-use? Do you privatize? What do you do? And the fourth layer is the most important, is what is the legal, social, regulatory, public safety aspects of this? If you want to use drones to move packages around, how would you ensure public safety? And the idea is, if you can figure out the regulatory changes that you need while the technology is under development, you hit the ground running. And so we're very excited about this process. We've this nonprofit is being led by the former CEO of One Laptop Per Child, and so he's got chops in building this stuff out. So we're pretty excited about this. In general, we think we can kind of apply this to any kinds of issues that we're dealing with. Okay? Now we've talked about all through this last 3 days about transportation becoming digital, energy becoming digital, healthcare becoming digital. How many of you are familiar with Soylent? Hopefully a decent number in the room. This is worth telling. It's kind of an encapsulation of what's going on. This is Rob Reinhardt, a software developer here in New York City, who got annoyed that he had to stop writing software to go eat lunch. You know, typical developer kind of a mentality. And when he goes to eat, he's eating really bad food. A friend of his is lifting these weights and drinking protein shakes to build muscle mass. And he says, why can't I drink a milkshake that gives me a whole meal? Then I don't have to stop my focus and go out and eat. Turns out it doesn't exist. So he works with 4 months with nutritionists and biochemists and comes up with Soylent, which, if you drink it, is 100% of the carbs, the fats, the nutrients, the vitamins, the minerals you need as a human being. Right? You can drink this and not take in anything else. In fact, people have lived on this for 6 months without taking anything else in. And they've lost a ton of weight. They're way healthier because they're getting the exact complement of what they need. Now, they're bored out of their minds, right? Because if you drink this for 6 months, you want to shoot yourself with boredom. But most of us do not eat because we have to. We eat because it's there. So I could drink a glass of this in the morning and do whatever I wanted for the rest of the day, and I don't have to eat my vegetables. Now, if most of us in the room, 35, 40 years or older, invented this, our first instinct would be to patent that recipe and license it to Mondelez, to Kraft, to Nestle as a business model, right? That would be the first instinct. This younger generation is different. He open sourced his recipe. Anybody in the world can go make this. And people said, that's amazing, but why would you do this? And he said, I have a massive purpose. I want to solve hunger. If there's an earthquake in Ecuador, if there's a famine in the Sahara, you should be able to drop boxes of this stuff in without needing me. So people said, great, but how will you make money if you've given it away and it's open source. And he said, I'm always going to have the best recipe. So there's release 1.4 of his food recipe. He's iterating his food recipe the way we iterate software. Okay? Food is now software. By the way, version 1.3 had a bug in it. It caused some gas. So if you see that on, if you see that on sale, you might want to skip to the next version. But there we go. Now we're going to iterate that, right? Now we're starting to understand what our microbiome is and all of the bacteria in our bodies and how different that correlates. I tell you what version 3 will be. I will send him a sample of my microbiome, and he will send me back a completely tailored version of this for my metabolism. And the food world will get completely disrupted by that, right? So this disruption is coming. It's hitting every single sector. We have to figure out how to leapfrog this and transition all of our old systems into this new world. Because this forcing function of technology is going to hit us like a ton of bricks, and it's starting already. Now we have two options. Right now we're headed down a pretty dystopian Mad Max kind of path of social structures, political structures, financial structures, and a mess across the side. We have to figure out how to undo that and re-tilt that future and head it towards abundance. And it's going to require some pretty significant leadership around the world to do it. And we call on you to please help us. If you see these technologies, if you appreciate what's happening, please go and implement them out in the world. Pick a startup, fund some startups, create a fund around this, go deploy these, because the more these get deployed, the more headroom we have and the more upside we get in getting to this future faster. So with that, thank you very much. I'm going to pause it there, and then we'll end it, and I'll call Will back to close it out. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.